Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to the Complete Whiskey Course. I'm Robin Robinson, and hey, let's be honest, man. We are in the first stages of our self-isolation here with the coronavirus. It's actually March 19th when I'm filming this, and yeah, when you look behind me, it's kind of like, I'm surrounded by all this whiskey, and of course you're probably thinking, man, if I'm going to be socially isolated, that's how I'm going to be socially isolated. But, when you take a look at all of these bottles I have here, and there's so many more over here and behind me that you can't see, these bottles are a reminder of the industry that we're in. And every one of these was made by someone. In order to make that, then they were dependent on other people to sell them raw materials and the packaged goods in order to put them in, and they employed people in order to actually have these made, and then it had to go out into the marketplace, into the distribution system, and that meant that people were working in warehouses and in package stores and as distributor salespeople and as bartenders in order to get the product to you. And now that's all in jeopardy. And for the first time, we see that the beauty of having all of this is indeed very fragile, and it's dependent on an enormous amount of people in what we call the supply chain. And here we are at a point where we have no idea what the end result of this is going to be, and it's a little bit frightening. And we're starting to see how this is impacting the daily lives of everyone involved in this entire supply chain, from the producer to the raw materials all the way to the very end in getting that product out to you. So the reminder here is to the degree that you can, keep purchasing from these people. Purchase in New York City. They're allowing now cocktails to go along with food at bars. Call them up and have them deliver. The package stores that are still open in your state, please go there and buy some products as well. And let's see what we can do to keep this entire chain alive. I'm going to start this with obviously a little bit of hand sanitizer, just to kind of stay on the safe side of everything. But this also brings up another good point. Is just recently the TTB, the federal organization that oversees the manufacture and the distribution of alcoholic beverages, has now allowed distilleries all over the United States to create the type of alcohol used for hand sanitation products. Previously, this was not allowed. If you made a potable, drinkable ethanol alcohol, you weren't allowed to make industrial alcohol like this. That's all been changed, so we're seeing now some really great effects of that. A lot of these smaller distilleries are creating alcohol in order to create hand sanitizers like this, and so we're going to start seeing a new distribution network in order to get this out to the people who need it, especially hospitals and hospices and nursing homes, and then perhaps out there into the marketplace to actually supplement a lot of the existing commercial stuff that has been disappearing off the shelves. So keep your eyes tuned for that, and check your local media outlets and social media for updates on that. So hey, look, at the end of the day, as human beings, what we've done with each other in times of good times and times of bad times is we've told stories to each other. And so I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you the story about whiskey, about how whiskey got into this bottle right here. And this is actually an old bottle of a Brook Lottie. This is actually one of my favorites that have been sitting on my shelf for a while. As you can see, I'm right down to some of the the last dregs here. This is called the Nori Campbell Tribute Bottling, and Nori Campbell was he was a peat farmer on Isla. And Nori was known to have, his entire life was spent in the peat fields. And he was known to have such a good nose that Nori would get up in the morning and he would stand in the middle of the peat field and he would just sniff the air. And he could tell by the type of moisture and the type of moisture content in the air exactly where they were going to dig on that particular day, because he knew just the sensitivity of his nose, which part of the peat field was ready for digging and ready for extraction. So again, this is like one of these great stories behind these brands that a lot of people don't really know about. And Nori's passed away now, and this was former master distiller at Bruichladdich, Jim McEwen's tribute to him. This is called the 3D3 also, so it's actually 3 different types of peating methods that were done on the barley and on the whiskey and the barrel itself. It's an extraordinary whiskey. I was just so happy to be able to log into this many years ago, right after Bruichladdich first started opening up and releasing some of their brands. And so this is a special bottle for me with a special story behind it. How do we get whiskey into a bottle? Right? How does whiskey get into any particular bottle that we may pull off of a shelf? Well, there's a long story, and the story is actually dependent on 3 or 4 people. Okay, so who's the first person? Well, the first person is the farmer. Now, okay, so I've gone through some casting with some Beanie Babies to actually help illustrate the story of whiskey right here, and I picked the bulldog because of its tenacity, and that represents, excuse me, the farmer. And the farmer had to be tenacious. Now, why is the farmer important on this? Well, 25,000 years ago, we started planting things because we started staying in one place. We transitioned from being hunters and gatherers, and we started to stay in one place and create civilizations. And in order to do that, we learned the ways to actually tame the land and farm and pull grain out of that farm, right? And well, eventually what happens is that we can't get all of the grain out of there in which to take to market and trade with other people. And some of it stays behind, and some of it rots in the fields, or some of it actually is gathered in containers and gets soaked with water and rots there. And that creates a very special organic situation that happens here, which is called fermentation. So as it rots, it exposes the sugar, and the sugar is exposed to the yeast in the air, and the wild yeast turn this from grain into a fermented beverage. And this is the beginnings of how we discovered ales and beers and fermented grain products that to this day we still drink and enjoy. If you went back tens of thousands of more years prior to our first attempts at civilization, you would have seen this happen with fruits and vegetables that rot much quicker and expose their sugar much easier, and therefore fermented much quicker than grains did. And that would be, for example, before wine was cultivated, the idea that grapes could be fermented and turned into this fermented beverage that did 2 things. It made you feel better because there were microbes all over the world, and we were ingesting them. And it also brought you to an elevated sense of reality, right? An elevated sense of reality. We all know exactly what that means. And both of these phenomenon are actually part of the civilization of human beings over scores and scores of thousands of years. So we come to this point now where we actually have this grain that is being dug out of the ground and then by one reason or another is fermented, and then over the years that fermentation has been carefully husbanded in order to make the ales and beers of civilizations all over the world. And that introduces us then to our second player in this story of whiskey. And that is the distiller. Okay, so I have cast as the distiller this particular Beanie Baby right here, which is a pink flamingo. And there's a reason for that, because distilling was so damn magical, was so out of the ordinary of what everyday thinking was from that perspective in history, that it was pretty much a pink flamingo, right? It pretty much stood out. And what happened there was, distillation progressed over thousands and thousands of years. It's known to go back perhaps to the ancient Sumerians and Egyptians, about 5,000 years ago, and then finds its way over the years as we go into, let's say, for example, the classical Greek period. It was surmised that Aristotle himself had used some sort of crude distillation in order to try to desalinate seawater. And then these esoteric improvements on the idea of taking one natural force, which was water, and turning it into another natural force, which was gas, and then back into another natural force, which was water again, was indeed magical and philosophical, and it was the roots of early alchemy from 1,000 years ago. And about 1,000 years ago, the center of all scientific knowledge in the Western world, at least that we know, was all pretty much concentrated in the area of the world that we now see as the modern Middle East. But it was the old Iranian and Persian empires, and the Sumerian empires, and Assyrian empires, and Alexandrian empires that made up that whole entire area. What releases that knowledge into the world was actually happened in the 8th and the 9th centuries, which with the rise of Islam, religious fervor from that area of the world. And those particular people who carried that forward were the Islamic invaders. They were the warrior priests of that era that in their evangelical zeal carried with them the roots of scientific knowledge at that point. They carried the roots of what we know as astronomy and mathematics and certain different architectural forms, and most specifically the idea of distillation, which was a magical science at that particular time in history. And so they bring this up into the through the Iberian Peninsula into Southern Europe, and Southern Europe at this point is an absolute mess. The Byzantine Empire had pretty much faded away. It was nothing but tribe after tribe. You had the Franks, and you had the Huns, and you had all of these other small tribes that were on raiding, that were doing raids all over Southern Europe, and it was just an absolute mess coming out of a time of darkness, of disease, of plague. And then here comes this idea of transferring a basic force of life, water, into a vapor, then back into a water again, and in doing so concentrating the things that were inside of that and making them much more potent. And this was used for centuries and centuries as cosmetics, as medicines, as everything except to drink a potable drink from it. And about at the turn of the first millennium, you start to see your first brandies, or that what we know as brandies, show up, because someone got the idea of taking one of those fermented beverages as wine, or some sort of fruit wine, and then putting it into a pot and distilling it, thereby making it more potent, higher in purity, higher in alcohol. And it became known as we now know it as a water of life, right? It was a physic that healed. It was a medicine. It could cure things. It was an antibiotic. It was an astringent. It was all of these different things now that had been brought to fore in the hands of the people who were understood how to use it. And one of those people, most specifically, were the sheltered abbots and monks of the Dark Ages, right? So they were essentially the only literate class at that time, because religion and power were very, very tightly bound together in Europe during the Dark Ages. And so these were the people who were literate. And when you're literate, then you have the understanding of how to take a very esoteric concept like this of transformation. And of course, that transformation from one fundamental element into another and then back into that again could only have been caused by divine intervention. And divine intervention means that only God could have touched this, and therefore this must be some sort of a Holy Spirit. And to this day, we still use the word spirit to identify alcoholic beverages. So now we have this concept, right? This concept of this water of life. In Latin would have been known as aqua vitae, water of life. And as it moves throughout Europe, it changes form. So when it goes into the Frankish Empire, which eventually became France, that was the developing of Old French, it became eau de vie, which means water of life, a word we still use today. When it went up into the Caucasus Mountains and the Ural Mountains, up in through what we now know as Eastern Europe and the western part of Asia and the Georgian steppes, where it became voda, or small water, where we get the word vodka today. As it goes up into the Nordic countries, it takes on the form of aquavit, still very close to its Latin origin and still pretty much the word that is used up there today, which is, again, the water of life. But it's not until it moves up into what we now know as the British Isles. In the British Isles, where it comes across a completely different type of a language, and that is Gaelic, and specifically where it lands in Ireland, because Christianity lands tightly in Ireland, and it meets the Gaelic language, and words for water of life become now ishkabiha. Right? It's no longer aquavita, it's ishkabeha. And ishkabeha is the Gaelic or Irish Gaelic version of water of life. And then as it moves with much more force into Scotland, the Celtic Gaels up there pronounce it slightly differently as ushkaba, the water of life. And both of these areas for hundreds of years were being subjugated by the British king, the British monarchs over years and years. And if you can't beat somebody by force, then the next best way to beat them is to actually sublimate their language and their culture. And so the languages of the Gaels and the Scotai and the Celts slowly being subsumed by the English, and the word ushkaba eventually becomes the word ushka. And as you can probably imagine over time how the word ushka eventually becomes the word that we have today as whiskey. Now, when you look at the ways of subjugation in all of these Western countries now, right? So now we have a beer. We no longer are dealing with the wines of Southern Europe and of Eastern Europe, but now we're in areas that are cool and they grow grains up there, and the idea of meads and ales and beers are actually widespread all throughout the countryside. And then here comes all of these itinerant distillers. Itinerant distillers that were released from all of the abbeys, and they were released from all of the cathedrals of the diminished Roman Empire after Henry VIII in 1536 decides to abandon his relationship with Rome and start his own religion of Anglicism. And all of these now tonsure monks are now cast out into the countryside, and what do they bring with them? They bring with them all of the R&D that they've been doing for hundreds of years with distillation and fermentation and beekeeping and animal husbandry and all of these arts that they had perfected in their isolation over 1,000 years, and now have brought these out into the countryside. And they help the farmers of each particular area turn their fermentable beers and ales and wines into something much more stable, much more intense, much more pure, and therefore much more valuable. Because now it is able to be transported. Now it is able to be used in a barter situation. Now this has a life beyond just its immediate drinkability. This actually now has legs. And when it has legs, it has value. And as soon as it has value, then it brings the next player into our story, which is, and don't take it badly, but this is the skunk. And the skunk represents the taxman, and the taxman in the form of the king or the state or the prince or some legal authority that is trying to extract revenue from the distiller in order to be able to increase their entire revenue coffers. And they found out that coming after not just the grain, but coming after the whiskey that resulted in that grain, they were able to actually now tax at a much higher rate and extract a higher income from that. And either that could be from the local landlord all the way up onto the crown itself. And when we look at the economic history of whiskey, and let's give it a starting point from somewhere, let's say in the 15th century, in Ireland, and then moving up through Scotland and into Wales and England, and then moving out of the old world into the new world, into Canada and into the United States. And when we look at the format of every one of those countries, it's actually the taxman who has more impact on the flavor of the style of whiskey, because the taxman forced the distiller to change. He forced him to innovate. He forced him to make changes in his process and his production in ways that he may never have had to do if he had not been chased for additional revenue. So when we look at the entire story of whiskey today, we think, well, it's really the distiller is the hero, and to many degrees that is correct. But it becomes the taxman who becomes the inadvertent major player in this entire story here. Because without their need to extract revenue, that they may not have made the changes. And when you go back and look at the interesting histories from Scotland, the different malt taxes, and finally the excise tax in the 1820s, to the malt taxes in Ireland, the taxation that the British government did on Canadian and U.S. governments early in their form, and of course it all ending, of course, with prohibition, and now the way that government oversees alcohol. To this very day, the taxman becomes like the big guy here, So, when it comes down to it, it's when we kind of look at all of the money that all of the economics behind all of this, we have the taxman at the heart of this. These are our players right here. We've got the farmer, we've got the distiller, we've got the monks and the and the warriors, and we've got the taxman. Those are our four big guys here in the story of whiskey. I hope you enjoyed story time. Hey, look, don't forget Stay safe out there, sanitize, wash your hands like crazy, right? And support everybody inside of the entire supply chain. Thanks a lot.